We arrived at St. Joseph Island at the end of the maple syrup season, and our daughter Linda arranged for a visit to the Gilbertsons' pancake house for a feast on their pancakes and maple syrup.
Although they had officially closed for the season, we were especially privileged as Kerry Gilbertson opened up the pancake house for the occasion, and very soon had the hot plates covered with those mouth-watering golden brown pancakes.
And the coffee pot was soon on the boil as well.
We waited with great expectation as we were soon to sample pancakes served with the ever-popular St. Joseph Island maple syrup.
The snow had almost gone by now, and the trees were still bare of leaves. It is only at this time of the year that the sap can be harvested. The syrup is made from the sweet water sap of the sugar maple tree, which is different from the circulatory sap. This sap will flow from a wound in the tree each time there is a period of freezing, followed by a period of thawing.
A small spigot is drilled into the tree and plastic hoses are attached to drain the sap into a large holding tank in preparation for converting into syrup.
Later that day we drove to another maple plantation. Production here had also ceased, but their equipment was still in place. Local maple syrup producers are quite happy to show visitors how their product is made. At this property, some sap was gathered in steel buckets, suspended below a spigot in the tree, a method used for many years until the late 1940s.
And as can be seen, there was still a tracing of snow on the ground from the last fall of a couple of days previous.
The pipes were still suspended and fed into larger pipes and finally into the main artery leading to the holding tank.
Bubbles in this pipe show movement of the sap.
At the close of the season, the holes in the tree are plugged and the plastic tubing washed and wound onto wooden frames for stowing away until next season. We were informed that the main damage sustained by the tubing was caused by squirrels biting through the plastic, attempting to get to the sap.
Trees are colour-coded so that a record may be kept of which trees are harvested each season.
The sap is sucked from the trees by vacuum, and this pump is used for that operation.
A boiler supplies the steam for heating the sap into syrup. This boiler was made in 1926 and is 74 years old and still going strong.
In a nearby cellar we could see a 3,000-gallon oil tank which fueled the boiler.
These metal pipes, now laid out for cleaning, are used for distributing superheated steam through a large pan of sap, dispersing the moisture from the sap and condensing it down to the required syrup.
We were shown a pan from which the tubes had just been dismantled. Sap is routed back and forth through this pan, being constantly superheated by the steam pipes on the way through.
The finest boiled nectar is collected in this tank and is held here in preparation for bottling and distribution.
Syrup flows through a row of filters to filter out the sugar sand, which can be turned into sweets.
2 days later, we paid a visit to another producer who was working as the sap was still flowing in his trees.
A large water tank provides water for the boiler.
Hot water fed to this preheater warms the sap prior to it entering the evaporation pan.
An electric pump sucks the air from this vacuum tank, which in turn draws the sap from the trees.
This in turn is transferred to a 1,000-gallon holding tank.
Outside, Steve Solomon draws our attention to the sap flowing from the trees and describes some of the ways in which the trees are cared for.
If you get a close-up, you can actually see the sap running into the star. It really is something to... Here's the one we just put a cap in this Monday. And here's a few old ones. It takes about 3 years for it to fully heal.
Back inside, we get a good look at the steady flow of sap in the main line as it is sucked from the trees.
And poured into the large baffle pan in preparation for boiling off the excess water and condensing the sap into maple syrup. 30 to 50 gallons of sap are required to make 1 gallon of syrup.
It does not take long for the steam in the pipes to bring the sap in the tray to the boil. The water is extracted from the sap in the form of steam and water vapour, which is dispersed into the atmosphere.
Sap is fed in at one end of the tray,
and when the correct density has been reached, is released at the other end as maple syrup. A reading on this gauge gives an indication that the syrup is ready to be released from the pan.
Maple syrup is produced solely in North America and was produced by the Indians of the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River prior to the arrival of the white settlers.
The sap contains 1.5 to 3% solids, mostly sucrose. It does not contain the flavour or colour of the maple syrup. These are imparted to the syrup as the sap is concentrated by evaporation in the open pans. The fluid is filtered through a fine gauze cloth into a holding tank, and the material remaining on top of the filter is known as sugar sand.
In over 300 years of history, the making of maple syrup had remained almost unchanged. Modernisation began in the late 1940s when, during the next 10 years, transportation of the sap from the trees by plastic tubing commenced, and central evaporator plants were also developed.
The refined fluid was piped to a heated stainless steel container, from which the syrup was then poured into the various receptacles for export and sale.
Containers come in many materials, such as tins, plastic and glass, in many shapes and sizes, all designed to enhance the sale of the product. We
visited the St. Joseph Island Museum on Open Day, and arrived to the accompaniment of the local musicians' display. Inside one of the buildings, we noticed a display showing the methods used over the years to procure the sap from the trees.
Indians in the late 1700s cut a nick across the bark and used a shaped piece of wood to direct the sap into buckets made of skins.
In the late 1800s, hollow sticks stuck into the tree pointed into wooden pails.
Around 1900 came the first iron spikes.
Later on came the metal pail and eventually the plastic tubing.
Pure maple syrup is derived by simply boiling the excess water out of the maple sap.
Meanwhile, back to the pancake house.
It was not long before the pancakes were looking good. Kerry had produced a beautiful golden brown batch for our meal that day.
Eunice and Brianna set about serving up the dishes, and the maple syrup was already on the tables.
Our introduction to St. Joseph Island could not have been more pleasant than on that day when we enjoyed maple syrup on our pancakes.